Hello, everyone. Welcome to Next Big Future. I'm Brian Wang. Today, I'm going to talk about getting to a complete climate fix at a global scale by 2030. So how big are the climate problems? So you're probably hearing a lot about 40 billion tons of CO2 per year, or that level, but it's actually bigger than that. So there's been 1 trillion tons of CO2 added to the world's atmosphere since the beginning of the industrial age. And the CO2 problem would actually be worse at 2.3 million trillion tons extra, if not for the fact that soil, trees, and the ocean absorb it. So soil, trees, and the ocean absorb about 60% of the CO2. So the Green New Deal, you also probably heard of, that was a US recommendation from the Democrats that we would have net zero energy gas emissions for the US and 100% renewable energy by about 2030, about 10 years after the enactment of the plan. Cost estimates range from $40 to $93 trillion to do that. President Biden had a more moderate plan for spending $1.7 trillion to $5 trillion per decade to reach net zero by 2050. But this is only the US portion of the 40 billion tons of CO2 per year, about 4 billion tons of CO2 per year. And then the renewable energy portion, actually, electricity is only a tiny part of that. Of the energy we use, there's electricity, and then we also use 5 times more energy for cars and for industry. So 10% of a problem for a global problem, only the current year-to-year problem, not going back to resolving anything that we did before, for $50 to $100 trillion. So France and Germany, compare them to look at certain aspects of how much certain solutions works for fixing electricity. France got 80% of electricity from nuclear power by building 58 nuclear power plants for about 400 billion euros, $440 billion. Germany spent about 50% more money, 600 billion euros over 25 years for 40% of its electricity from renewables. Which does not count 66% of the energy they import from France for nuclear, for natural gas, and other things. So they actually, it's only about 16% of it. So France got far more for less, even though people think, oh, nuclear expensive versus solar. So certain things aren't intuitive. But also Germany trying really hard and not getting the full results, despite they'll be spending over $1 trillion and still not getting all the electricity done, which is again only part of the problem. So part of a country that is 4 times lower population than the United States and only getting half or whatever the electricity problem, so like 10% of their total energy needs. So I said it's only 20% of energy that most places use, because you have electricity for lights, for houses, for heating, and then you have industrial factory energy, and then transportation energy, not just cars, but also ships and planes, etc. So these previous solutions talked about spending hundreds of $trillions to, if you were to scale them up to fix the 40 billion tons per year, and maybe you get that solution by 2060, 2100, maybe. So how are we viewing this all wrong? Do we talk about getting to food neutral? Because feeding ourselves, that's easily as important as climate, because climate, maybe we'll have certain problems, 2% economy issues, something like that, 2100, some certain flooding, versus if we don't feed ourselves even for a few weeks, then people starve and we have mass death. So the food problem is more serious. Farmers were 90% of the world in 1700, still in certain places they are, but for the world it was 9%. And then we transitioned so that fewer people did the important work of farming to feed the world and export, got that specialization, and then everyone else did everything else and created a far richer global economy. So from 9% down to 2% of the people. And when we talk about people being net negative on food, most people being negative on food is okay. It's like 98% of the people are net negative, 2% are super positive, and then the whole vital problem gets solved. So having 9% farmers is costly and stupid. It went back to being 9% farmers that would, mean that 98% of the economy gets wrecked. The plans to change everything are dumb too. If I'm going to fix the climate, everything has to change. Let's change every car, every plane, every ship, every building. In theory, you can do that. Maybe you do want to do that. But to say you have to do that and urgently increases the cost and makes things stupid. And I don't consider how long it takes to change things, how long it takes to make our global energy grid. Starting from the time of Edison till today, 100 years to build that out. And we don't even have the workforce or rail geared up to make massive changes to the energy grid. We change about 1-2% per year in Europe and North America. So we don't want to spend 100 years and $100 trillion, whatever, hundreds of trillions of dollars to fix the global problem. So what is the answer? What can be affordable, fast, and what has already been proven to scale? But some of these things have not been proven that you can actually do them and then do a lot of it. So history has shown that lots of plants can radically change the global world atmosphere. Go back looking over 500 million years, 520 of the last 530 million of the last 540 million years have had the world at a hotter temperature than today. So, and we had multiple points where we brought the temperature down by 12 degrees. We want to bring the temperature down by 1 degree or 1.5 degrees. And then we've done 10 times more than that, 12 degrees, 15 degrees. How'd that happen? Because we had certain things where certain plants developed that got massive dominance. So the Azolla event a few million years ago was where these floating plants grew onto the ocean, spread across large sections of the ocean, sucking in CO2, because half of a plant, half of a tree is like CO2. So then whatever the mass of that growth is, when it dies, it takes that to the bottom of the ocean. But you can also do it on land. So by constantly growing things and then having it go to the bottom of the ocean, you can take out as much CO2 you want. And you can take the temperature down from 28 degrees Celsius down to whatever number you want, where you create ice ages. So plants work, clearly, historically. Everyone knows this. You can just say, hey, I'm breathing out oxygen, breathing in oxygen, breathing out CO2. Trees breathe, in CO2 and breathe out oxygen. The plants work, farming works. So remember at the beginning I mentioned that 2.3 trillion tons of emissions were generated over the last 200 years. But 60% of that has already been absorbed by trees, soil, and the ocean. So how to make these things that work at clear scale, beyond a scale we've currently done for anything else work. If we use less land for farming, so not just less people, 2% of the people versus 90%, maybe we can use 2% of the land or 4% of the land, some smaller number. Greenhouses were invented in 1680, so something that's been around for over 300 years can grow 10 to 30 times the food in the same space and 10 times less water. Can this scale up? It already has. The Dutch created a nation of greenhouses to grow tulips over 100 years ago, and China is now scaling greenhouses. 2 million hectares, about 5% of their arable land. They're making controlled greenhouses and can do that by 2025. And China has 20% of the world population. They're going to feed half their people from food from greenhouses. And for a cost, they're going to do this for like $40 billion to get all this stuff. The entire world could go with greenhouses, use 5% of the land or even less for about $260 billion. Even if this cost estimate are off, say it's 500 billion, that's still a trillion. It's still 100 times less than a plan to reduce the emissions of the United States. And China can do this far faster. We're going to start feeding 10% of the world population, 4 times the US population, in just 3-4 years. They started maybe 2 years ago, so like a total of 5 years to get this done. So it's can scale and scale fast. At that point, they've doubled up. I could have, twice so much food, greenhouse food and regular land food. Once you've proven that, okay, now it's safe. I got my greenhouse food. Then they can then take the extra land, farming land, and convert that over to forests. So World Greenhouse Status already has 500,000 hectares of common greenhouse. So China's going to take that by 4 times. China's already used a sort of more crude form of greenhouses where they have plastic sheeting over metal and bamboo poles to grow 30% of the vegetables. And the China Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs is doing this. So by 2055, 10% of the world food from greenhouses. Super seeds can also densify because we want to reduce the land we need for farming so we can have more room for forests to suck up CO2. Super seeds can triple the food on land. So there are already many countries, China has them, the US have them, where they breed out super seeds, they create test farms to grow the seeds. So they already have these seeds on test farms growing triple the food. Instead of 5 tons of food per hectare, they make 15 tons. And then they just distribute it. And then this is done through the ag business by Monsanto and the other big ag companies. So less farmland, then grow trees. So that's the second half of the equation. So 4 billion hectares currently used for growing forests, 5 billion hectares for farming and ranching, 1.7 billion hectares for crops, 3.3 billion for grazing. So if we have less farming, then grow the trees. We have 3 trillion trees now. Go back into before humans around, the estimate is that we had 6 trillion trees. The trees currently weigh about 2 trillion tons. Half of that is CO2. So 1 trillion tons of CO2, which was that number that we want to get out, right? So if we double the trees, 1 trillion tons of CO2, we take out all of the CO2 that we've ever produced over the last 200 years. We get back to the pristine state before industrialization. In the studies in the Journal of Science, the most recognized scientific journal, there's a potential for adding 1.3 trillion new trees. They've done satellite studies, looked at every bit of land, just acre by acre, hectare by hectare, to say where could we add trees, where there's not cities, not other things that we don't want to displace. So we wouldn't have to convert farmland into this scenario where you just have the room for 1 trillion trees. But if we do reduce farmland, the land we use for farming, then we can double up the trees. And that would take out some of the ambiguity out of is this tree thing working? Are we taking out CO2? If you double the forest, you will create, 2 trillion tons of trees. And then 1 trillion tons of that will be CO2. It'll be like this clear endpoint will work. 3 trillion tons of trees for that 600 billion, 1 trillion tons of CO2, because they have to grow. The trees have to grow. But once you plant it, that tree will be there and it'll be big. Forests also absorb 16 billion tons of CO2 per year now globally. The rough estimates, sometimes people think it'll be more. And if you double that, then they'll also absorb another 16 billion tons of CO2. So again, you have over the 20 however many years that you're growing your trees, it's absorbing, converting, becoming giant trees with a trillion tons of CO2. Afterwards, as it's operating, it's absorbing more CO2 because forests are net absorbers of CO2. So there's some debates about trillion trees. Another National Academy of Science study talked about if we did 150 metric tons per year, want to absorb that, you need 4 million hectares. So I'm talking about, 2 trillion, I'm talking about the billion of hectares, right? 4 billion hectares for forests now, and then finding a way to get another 2 billion hectares instead of the 4 million. So I'm talking about going up 500 times versus the scenario they're talking about. And I think the forest can be harvested. I know that they actually harvesting would be good. Logging means I have space for this tree. I cut it down. The wood is still there, still holding CO2. And then I can process it and make houses, 1 billion houses, house more people because the wood's still good in holding CO2. But then I can plant another tree. So then in 20 years, that tree's replaced and you have more stuff. You're taking 1%, whatever, 2% of the forest that you're managing and converting the wood, the tree into wood for houses, building, and other things. So 1.2 billion hectares, like just look only 300 times more than the 4 million they're talking about. That's absorbing 45 billion tons per year, which would be more than the 40 billion that we are generating from everything else. So I don't say I convert everything, worry about converting things, just like I don't say everyone has to grow food for farmers. You have an industry that would then be foresting and offsetting all the CO2. So I don't have to change anything else. It doesn't matter anymore. There's no moral thing. Oh, you're generating CO2. It doesn't matter. We're offsetting the whole thing, with a small percentage of our economy. They completely offset all the emissions, and then have an extra 5-7 billion tons per year, trying to pay down the trillion tons extra. But you have your time, because we know that this atmosphere is relatively okay, and then you're starting to improve it step by step. It's getting worse, it's getting better. So they've already got it solved. Like I've offset everything I'm generating globally, not just the US, and you're paying down. And if you do a bit more, like 2 billion hectares at 1.2, then you can pay down the 1 trillion CO2 ton debt faster. There's also been other studies of global tree restoration, things we talk about 900 million hectares of continuous forest, and that taking care of 200 billion tons. So clearly the general scientific estimate is 2 billion hectares, 3 billion hectares is enough to offset everything. You don't have to be precise. You start doing it, and then you can start looking at the effect in the atmosphere and knowing, oh yeah, it's now we've completely fixed it or not. So we can stop the net loss of trees. We've been trying to plant more trees, spending about $50 billion a year doing that, but we haven't been planting enough. We have been net reducing our debt of deforestation every year, but we're still negative 10 million hectares because people are, cutting down the Amazon, building cities, doing other things. So the effort to get more trees is working, but we need to speed it up. Instead of improving 6 million hectares over 30 years, we need to do 100 million hectares every year, 120 million hectares every year. That would clearly get us to the 1.2 billion in 10 years. So we need to speed up, instead of going from negative 25 plus minus 8. So instead of negative 17 million hectares, getting to negative 13, so getting better, we need to vastly speed this up. So how can we do that? There are now dozens of companies working on drone planting to speed this up. Drone, seed, flash forest, dendro systems, many others. So some of them have planted a few million trees, perhaps. None of them have gotten to 1 billion trees yet. So there's still issues to do. They've been working for years on it. One of the issues is that there's a low seed survival rate, that they make these seed pods and they plant them. So you plant, say, 100,000 of them, only perhaps 20% actually take root and then become trees, because you're not being as careful as a person doing it. So there are tree planting charities. Here's a list of 10 of them. One of the biggest, the Eden Reforestation Project, they've planted over 500 million trees, 580 million, in various African, Asian countries. And they use a lot of local people who are poor, unemployed, and they suppose they have the funds for 48 billion trees by 2030. So their thing is a bit more precise, and that's not, trying to use 2 people to plant 100,000 trees. I use a few thousand to plant that number, and it's more precise because they can plant it, water it, and do a few other things to make sure that they grow. Plant with purpose also is a bit smaller, also working on it. So again, the group's working on it. And then, so then besides these other existing efforts and finding ways to scale those up with countries and stuff like that, I would propose that we then have programs to subsidize farmers, to give them the funds to make a lot of greenhouses, which China's doing it, and because they're doing that, they're bringing down the cost of the greenhouses. And then say, okay, farmer, you have 1,000 acres, Let's take 10% of that to build greenhouses on that. The greenhouses get production. He's getting all the food production and other things from the greenhouses, using less water as well. And then we then start converting over the open land to growing trees or other plants, but let's assume trees. So then we master fast reforestation, and then we scale. So we need to get at least 10 times better at faster reforestation with drones, with other things. Figure out the issues with the drone planting, find ways to improve that. Maybe it'll be Tesla bots that end up doing it. So greenhouses and converting farms put this to the level of a global climate solution. Maybe it involves taking the 50 billion, if we're spending 50 billion per year already, either we get that 10, 20 times more efficient and get, instead of $50 billion and getting 50 billion trees, $50 billion and getting 1 trillion trees or 2 trillion trees, or we up the funds. If we up it to 500 billion, $1 trillion, that's still way cheaper than everything else that we've been doing. And we actually have already spent well over $1 trillion on climate solutions that have, I don't think you've noticed the impact. We're still net negative and all these things. So 1 trillion trees can't work. We need to think bigger, think offsets, master all the problems. There are other solutions like growing kelp in the ocean, algae blooms. Kelp pollution probably at like, tens of millions. And there is some industry there. Algae blooms, I think I have another video on that. But biological solutions are clearly the more affordable thing. There have been other things like, we'll do CO2 scrubbing off of oil plants, something like that. So that equipment, like in a facility in Weyburn or another one in the north around Norway, you're building $1 billion facility, 1,000 tons of metal, all these pipes and stuff like that. And over the last 2-3 decades, I think maybe taken 1 million tons of CO2 in the 2 biggest projects. Grow 10 million trees, you've done more than that. So this is, and the cost per that ton of CO2 was like $100 per ton versus less than $1 for all the biological solutions. There need to be measurement, fraud prevention, and we need to get this to beyond the level of noise and clearly to net positive. So that's why I see the complete climate fix, like the greenhouse growing generation, that is going to be at 1/10, 1/20th what it needs to be when China completes their massive greenhouse projects. And then we're already doing billions of tree planting things. We just need to scale up, speed that up. So, and then if we convert land use, just like we reduce the number of people doing farming, if we convert the amount of land for farming, then we can have a lot more land for trees and for forests or for the wildlife, which can be made to be a CO2 sink that would then completely offset, resolve this issue at a very affordable cost. We'd have the food, but we've been around with water. So this would be the path to achieve that complete solution. So we don't have to freak out that, this is unsolvable. Nothing unsolvable greenhouses, we know they work. Nothing else unsolvable about growing trees. So this is something where you can say, nothing you can say, how does that work? The scaling, are we tossing something into space to block the sun? No, none of that. Just doing things that exist for centuries or for millennia to solve this. Don't turn over our economy to do it. Just adjust 2% of our economy, the farming economy, into farming and forestry. Okay, well, thank you for your time, and join me next time. If you can like and share, subscribe on Patreon and on YouTube, that would be very helpful. Thanks very much. Talk to you next time.